So asset-based community development is working to the idea that people have strengths within them and that they have resources around them, and that those strengths and resources can be useful in creating a life of their own choosing. So it very much works on that idea that not alone at an individual level, but in neighbourhoods across an entire community, there's an abundance of possibilities, resources, what we call assets, that are yet to be connected into productive action. So by assets I mean the gifts and talents, the capacities of individuals, right? The gifts of the head, things they know, the gifts of the heart, things that they are passionate about, and gifts of the hands, things that they can make and do. I'm also talking about associations, so networks, clubs, groups, like book reading clubs, knit and natter groups, and more complex civic groups, like we're seeing emerge in Greece at the moment, for example, through solidarity movements. These are all associations. They're not formed like institutions are formed. So they're organized by network rather than hierarchy. And they're really powerful in taking individual assets and amplifying them and multiplying them. So 3 or 4 people can come together in an association and are more powerful than they are individually. The other meaning of the term of asset, if you like, is this idea that institutions, when they organize themselves as treasure chests, right? So they're in service of people. They organize themselves the way people organize their lives, as opposed to expect people to organize their lives the way their service are organized. Then they're an asset. When systems organize themselves out of self-interest and are inward-looking, they tend to be a liability to citizen life and to citizen empowerment. So there's something really powerful, I think, in that definition of asset, where the individual, the association, and the institution are actually working very much together to try to figure out how they can release the inventiveness of the local community. Obviously, the place itself is really powerful. So, when we think about how do you create a total place transformation, obviously organizing at the level that people organizes is about working in a neighborhood, not just working with the aggregation of older people or younger people. And that's a really important message, because we live in a time when young people and older people are the most age-segregated populations in our society. We've constructed a care model which is segregationist, which actually says that older people are best put with other older people. I don't know about you, but my mother would be very clear in saying she does not want to be surrounded by older people sitting in chairs that look like they were bought from the exact same catalogue that every other residential unit seems to buy its chairs. She wants a life, not a service. And so thinking about communities and neighbourhoods as opposed to aggregated groupings is really important. So that's another asset. And then the asset of exchange. So people actually connecting across the life course. One of the great challenges in thinking about aging well is that we just think about older people, instead of actually thinking about aging well across the life course and across an entire community. When you start thinking about it at that level, you get a completely different set of possibilities. When you narrow it down to vulnerable older people who just have deficits, and you link it to institutions that allegedly have all of the solutions and the technocratic expertise, then you're into something that isn't just unsustainable when you run out of money, but it's actually unsustainable morally. So I often say that asset-based community development is not about saving the system money. It's about saving people from a life of institutionalization. Now, we may not have the same walls that we created 30 or 40 years ago, but if all we're offering vulnerable older people is a life of institutionalized programmatic intervention, then we're failing, frankly. So the question isn't how do we do this in a time of austerity. I think the question is, how do we ensure that in an effort to be helpful and supportive to people when they are vulnerable, that we don't compromise their assets, their resilience, and the capacities of their family, kin, and their neighbours, essentially, to be helpful as well. So it's very much about right balance and proportionality. And I think the other asset that I would mention is heritage and culture. If we're taking people out of their heritage, out of their culture, and for reasons of efficiency, we're busing them to centres where we can aggregate them with other people with the same kinds of pathologies as them, then we're disservicing them, not servicing them. So there are some of the assets, and I think that principle of recognizing people and the associations that surround them as the core starting point is really important. So in terms of the sequence of change, I would say that there are three sequences through which we can really think about aging well. The first is really looking at the assets that are local and close to the person, within them and around them, and how they can be mobilized so that person can create a good life of their own choosing. And that means changing the questions we're asking. So instead of talking about how do we treat dementia sufferers, we need to be having a conversation about how you can live well with dementia in a place that you call home for as long as possible. So that's kind of a potted version or sense of what asset-based community development is about and what it might have to offer. So I think the councils that have intrigued me, and impressed me, I suppose, are the ones that are really keen to figure out and are figuring out how to lead by stepping back. So they understand that the challenge isn't to move in and mobilize this great army to defeat the problems that older people have, but actually to figure out how they can be supportive of the inventiveness of local community with older people at the center of that inventiveness. And some of the organizations, institutions that I've seen do that include Leeds City Council, and I know you're familiar with some of their work, and also Croydon. And in both instances, I think that's what they really paid attention to. So it really is about not being patriarchal, not moving into the rescue or the palliative mode, but trying to really think about how can we be in right relationship with local people, and recognizing that's not about a service idiom at all. So typically local authorities are organized to provide statutory services to consumers. What Leeds and Croydon are doing, they're not alone, is they're flipping that on its head. And they're saying, actually what we should be doing is we should be starting with a view of how we can be of service to citizens, how we can match our resources and skill set with theirs, putting them at the front and at the center. So some of the practicalities of that would be moving away from just providing services into doing what I call community building. So in Croydon, for example, across 4 local authorities, or across 4 neighbourhoods, what has happened is community builders are actually at street level and are speaking to people. So one of the first things they do is they find connectors. They're local people, often older people, but not exclusively, who are just good at building relationships. So instead of doing the classic community development thing, which is to go in and speak to the existing groups and the chairpersons of the existing groups that are organized, what they're doing is going in at street level, literally almost door-to-door level, really, and they're engaging with local people. Many of them are not actually people who go to meetings at all, and finding out from them, how does this community network, how does it get connected, and who's not connected yet. So practically in Croydon what happened was they identified about 29 what they called connectors. They're local residents who just are good at building relationships. And those 29 connectors spoke to about 5 to 10 of their neighbours a week. Many of them were isolated, but not exclusively so. And began to get a picture, not of the deficits and the misery of the place, because they didn't ask for that. What they asked for was, what are your passions? What do you care about? What do you love doing? If 3 or 4 of your neighbours helped you, what would you love to do around here, right? And what they started to garner was a real sense that there's a reservoir of untapped potential, right? Because of course, it's there, it just wasn't looked for before. So in a way, what they're doing in Leeds and Croydon and other places is kind of like an act of revelation. Now what I would say to you is that Leeds and Croydon took our advice, and our advice was, sometimes a local authority by definition isn't best placed to be the person to employ the community builder. So in a sense, what they did was they took a savvy approach to commissioning. And they thought about, how do we commission second-tier or third sector organizations, not just third sector organizations, but second-tier organizations that are close up to civic life. I mean, literally to street level. And by the way, not all third sector organizations are close up to street level. Many work in a different way. But who are the ones that are trusted at that level, and who would tomorrow morning be in a position to go out and do some of this street-based work? And they identified core people that they could commission to do that. Our job was to work with them, to mentor them, to retrain them and support them. And I think that's significant, because essentially what we're seeing there, and I'm seeing it, we have 11 learning sites across the UK now. So there's a number of local authorities involved in all of those sites across the UK. And what's becoming quite clear to me is, I think what we're seeing is a commissioning structure that's very different than the norm. So what we're encouraging local authorities to do is to say to second-tier organizations, we're interested in commissioning you, not so that you can grow your client base. So we won't any longer reward or measure you on the basis of how many older people you have coming to your programs, okay, which is sort of the norm as it exists right now. It's the deficit model, okay. What we'll do instead is we'll measure you on the basis of your capacity to support older people to get connected productively with local residents in the neighbourhoods where they live. Now that doesn't mean that we're not going to commission services, but what it does mean is we're going to create a new front end, where in the first instances, people's assets close at home are mobilized, and so that we can be more clear then about what else needs to happen, what external support needs to be drawn in to match that. And actually you can't figure that out except in sequence, you know, because if you start with the question of what do you need from outside, what supports do you need, it has the unfortunate effect of displacing the relevance of uncredentialed local organic assets. They seem inconsequential by comparison with, you know, a professional intervention. And it's very understandable why that would happen. So a lot of what Leeds and Croydon are doing, I think, is they're just, almost it's an act of revelation. They're kind of revealing some of the hidden resources that we don't value and we don't prioritize. The first question is, what is it that citizens can do to produce a good life using their own resources? And that isn't an attempt to foist responsibility onto the citizen. It's an attempt to recognize that there are irreplaceable functions that we as human beings, as citizens, have that there is no government proxy for. There shouldn't be. If a government comes in to do what we do best, then it disables us. In other words, it disables citizenship. It's anti-democratic. So the second question is, what can we do using local resources to produce a good life and age well, but with some help from outside? So some people call that co-production. And I think the final question in the sequence is, what's left for local government? And that's the provision of statutory services. Now, what are we actually doing? I think what we're doing is we're reversing the sequence. The first question we ask is, what should local government do to make the lives of the clients, the consumers, as good as possible, particularly when they're vulnerable? Then we talk a little bit about co-production. So how do we get, parent participation? Let's talk about older people as experts by experience and so forth. And then as an afterthought, we talk a little bit about, what resources have they to do stuff themselves, because we're running out of money. Now that, to my mind, is a hiding to nothing. Right? So the first thing we have to get clear is, what's our mental map of reality? The map is not the territory. Currently, our map is a scarcity map. It says that most of the places we're trying to help and the people we're trying to help are backwaters of pathology. They're the sum of their problems. And that's the first thing we need to change. So it's about moving from an obsession with what's wrong to a real, genuine concern to understand what's strong, and then using what's strong to address what's wrong and make strong stronger effectively. So I think that's the first thing. How do we just get a different mindset, a different lens going, not just with regard to aging, but with regard to health, with regard to community housing, with regard to local economies, right across the piece. Now, here's the thing. Working in a deficit-based way, as I've described it, segmenting the communities in the way that I've described, is utterly unscientific. The great preponderance of evidence tells us that what determines our health actually is predominantly about community building and the assets within our local communities. And yet we're doing the opposite. So it's profoundly ironic to me when I hear local authorities saying, we want to save money. Well, I'd say, save money by not disabling the assets in local communities. That's your starting point. And actually what you'll find is, if you not alone disable them, but you help identify, connect and mobilize them, then an awful lot of what you're spending money on now, you won't be spending money on in the future. So an economist might call that an invest to save. I'd call it an invest to live. The local authorities that I think are most interesting are the ones that are actually using their convening power, almost commissioning by influence, rather than commissioning by money, to help us to think differently about what we mean by civil society, what we mean by aging, what we mean by being a community, and what we mean by services. The potential is huge. It's actually no less than the renegotiation of the social contract. To do this work well, you've actually got to kind of trust the community to drive the process and define their own outcomes. And so you're not commissioning to get a health outcome or an aging well outcome or a youth outcome. You're commissioning to get better connectivity and then to support the community to define its own outcomes as citizens and to identify for you what you can do to be helpful. Why do we have so many older people aggregated together with other older people lonely, and so many younger people aggregated with other younger people lonely? Both needing to be needed, not in a program, not singing Wheel Out the Barrel or climbing up a rock face 100 miles away from their neighborhood, but actually saying, I'm a community builder. I'm not a leader of tomorrow, I'm a leader of today. I can make things happen in my community, and I'm not just defined as a fragile, vulnerable, aging person. I am the most powerful person in a democracy. And you see, that's where the healthcare and the social care revolution will begin. When people who've been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem, that's where the revolution starts. Why do we see situations whereby when we think about how to move forward as professionals, we're seeing no great exit strategies or real thought about legacy? And I think the reason is that often as professionals, like I said earlier, we need people's needs almost as much, if not more, than they need our services. So there's a power relationship. And it explains why we start with a needs analysis rather than an asset inventory. That's why we don't ask people, well, what resources have you got that you could use? It almost would sound rude for me if an older person said to me, I'm feeling vulnerable. And I said, yeah, well, that's fine, but what resources have you got to resolve that issue? Now, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't ask that question that way, because actually the broader question is, what would a good life look like for you? And what around here could we connect you up with that would be good for you and good for them? So it's a reciprocal relationship. And that's, in a sense, I'm minded to tell you a story, if that's okay, about a piece of work that happened in Croydon, and it's just a slice of the story, if you like. It's kind of an incision. But Shirley, who's a connector, unpaid, a local person, had been having conversations with her neighbours, really just doing what we call an asset map, trying to find the treasure chests in the local community. And she had met a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Ackman, who had 2 young kids. They weren't very happy where they were living in Thornton Heath, felt they were in cramped conditions. But she talked a lot with them about their passions and what they love to do. And they talked about their kids, their love of their kids, but the fact they had no garden. They talked about loving, they had an allotment when they lived in another part of London. And they talked, Mrs. Ackman in particular talked about her love of cooking and collecting recipes. And later on the same day, Shirley was having a conversation with Peggy, who was 76 years of age, and had spent most of the last 6 years in her house, pretty much a prisoner in her own home, for a variety of reasons. Quite, a range of multiple support needs, very serious arthritis, cats running around the home, a dank smell. But clearly there were issues. The garden was overgrown, and Peggy was only allowed in, really, or Shirley rather, was only allowed into Peggy's house because they knew each other and she trusted her. But Shirley was able to broker a connection between Peggy and Mr. and Mrs. Ackman, their kids, and what has resulted now is Mr. and Mrs. Ackman and Peggy actually have an allotment in the back of Peggy's house, so her garden's looked after. Peggy is now accepting services that she would not have accepted before that, because she was afraid. She was afraid she was going to be put in a home, in her words. She's living well in a lot of ways, still requires services, right? So she still needs the intervention of the state, but not nearly as much as she would have without those associations. What's also really significant is this is not a charity model. This is not, Mr. and Mrs. Ackman are not volunteers coming to rescue Peggy, right? There's a reciprocal relationship. They need each other as much, one to the other, as you could hope in any healthy relationship. And what's also significant is that's a community garden. So it's not just Peggy's and the kids and Mr. and Mrs. Ackman's. Other people are growing produce in that garden. And it's triggering other people to use their gardens to create allotments, or the equivalent of. So it spawns all kinds of possibilities that you can't get by a service model or a charity model. And I think that's a big concern that I have. I hear a lot of local governments saying, well, people will just have to do more for themselves because we don't have the resources, so we need to start a volunteer drive. The idea that we're going to find volunteers and that we're going to use them to pepper on all the social problems that we can no longer afford to fix using a scarcity model and an interventionist model is ludicrous, and it's dangerous. But the idea that we could actually support people to get more connected in reciprocal relationships where they live and do the things that they care about, and then have services in reserve, is absolutely plausible and achievable. And not alone theoretically so, it's practically so. So I can point you to living examples on the streets of London right now. And that's, to me, what makes this very real and tangible.